This is a Fox News alert. Right now, federal appeals court judges are deciding whether to restore President Trump's executive order blocking arrivals from 7 majority Muslim countries. The ruling could come at any moment, and of course we'll bring you there live if it does. But first, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Just a short time ago, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments from the Trump administration and the opposing states. Those would be Washington and Minnesota. We'll talk to a Republican critic of the travel ban in just a second. But first, here's what just happened in court a minute ago.
Has the government pointed to any evidence connecting these countries with terrorism?
These proceedings have been moving very fast. The strongest point on that is that in 2015 and 2016, both Congress and the administration made determinations that these 7 countries posed the greatest risk of terrorism, and in doing so restricted visa waiver to people who had even traveled to those countries over the last 5 or 6 years. The executive order relies on that determination.
Your Honor, the case law from this court and the Supreme Court is very clear that to prove religious discrimination, we do not need to prove that this order harms only Muslims or that it harms every Muslim. We just need to prove that it was motivated in part by a desire to harm Muslims. And we have alleged that.
How do you infer that desire if, in fact, the vast majority of Muslims are unaffected?
Well, Your Honor, in part you can infer it from intent evidence. I mean, there are statements that we've quoted in our complaint that are rather shocking evidence of intent to discriminate against Muslims, given that we haven't even had any discovery yet to find out what else might have been said in private. I mean, the public statements from the President and his top advisors reflecting that intent are strong evidence, certainly at this pleading stage, to allow us to go forward on that claim.
Well, New York Congressman John Faso is a Republican, newly elected, but he's also a critic of the president's order, saying it was neither well-drafted nor well-implemented. Our Congressman joins us here in the studio. Congressman, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.
So it's kind of hard to argue with well-drafted, well-implemented. Okay. You said this in a press release. This being any kind of restrictions on immigration from these countries, most effectively pursued through thoughtful and deliberate legislation. God bless you for suggesting a legislative answer, I think.
Yeah.
What would that legislation look like? What would the thoughtful legislation achieving this goal be?
Well, I think let's see what happens with the Court of Appeals. But
right.
I do think thoughtful legislation was done previously by Congress, where they identified those 7 countries, and they were worried about the fact that those countries did not have proper internal procedures to vet those people
right.
who were looking to come to the United States. Where I think the order went awry was when they were looking at people who had dual citizenship, people who had already had visas, who had already gone through a process. So I'm hopeful now that they will have a more deliberative process internally, and I think they're doing that, to fix the mistakes that were in the executive order. Now, if the court upholds the lower court decision, then this is going to last for a few weeks more, certainly maybe months more, while the Supreme Court ultimately considers this. But if the court rules as I think they will, which is that the plaintiffs the 2 states don't actually have standing to bring this case, then I think it's incumbent upon the administration to fix the implementation. And I think they're on the way to doing that.
But why wouldn't it be incumbent upon the legislative branch to pass laws that have the same effect, which is to protect the country?
Well, we can very much do that, and I think first Congress should have some hearings, do an inquiry into this, but clearly the pattern over the last 50 years has been to give the president, the executive, under the law,
right.
wide powers to protect the national interests of the United States. And I would note, and some of the critics ignore this, President Obama made multiple decisions of this nature, not of the broad-reaching nature as President Trump did, but he specifically, as late as January, restricted the rights of Cubans
right.
to come into the United States.
He just did that, that's right.
He just did it in January. And if I went back tonight looking at some of the other executive orders that President Obama and President Bush made, and in the last 10 years we've seen probably 24 similar efforts by a president to restrict the travel into the United States from foreign nationals of countries where we were either having economic sanctions or we were having other disputes, whether it be the Ukraine, parts of the Ukraine, Russia, countries in Africa.
So, I mean, look, the criticism is diffuse. Some of it is about the way this was implemented,
right,
such as yours. Some of it is philosophical, and you get the sense that a lot of the critics of this don't believe the U.S. government has the moral right to make distinctions between countries of origin. So let me just ask you a couple of philosophical questions to get your sense of this. Do you think we face, in the aggregate, generally, a greater threat from immigrants who come from Somalia than we do from immigrants who come from, say, South Korea? Is that a fair statement?
Without a doubt, absolutely.
Without a doubt.
They do, because if you look at the governance or lack thereof in a place like Somalia, where there's mayhem and chaos widely available in the country, as opposed to South Korea, in your example, where there's a rule of law, there's order, there's a process whereby the citizens can be vetted, and where those countries, South Korea or others that we have close relationships with, can have a good relationship between our consular officials, our embassies, etc. And so when they say, here's our countryman wanting to come to the United States, he's looking for a visa,
right,
we have a process whereby we can have confidence that when they say this person is okay, and we vet them ourselves, we have confidence in that the person is who they say they are.
Of course, and it comports with common sense. So your second question. Our current understanding is that foreigners have a right to come here until we can show they pose a danger to us in some way. Shouldn't our assumption be that nobody has a right to come here until they can show us the benefit of their coming here?
Well, I think that what we want to be careful about being overbroad here, Tucker, because we do have countries where we have close economic and political relationships: Germany, France, the United Kingdom, etc., Ireland, Denmark, Japan, South Korea. So we don't want to make it unduly difficult for universities, for tech companies, for business travelers.
But you're proving my point. You're saying that those immigrants benefit the United States in some material, measurable way.
That's right.
Shouldn't that be the standard for all immigrants? Love to have you. Tell us what you can do for us. Why wouldn't that be rationally acting in our own interest?
Well, and one thing that we could be doing that, and we should be doing that rationally in our own interest. And one of the things that we should be doing is we should look at what are the benefits that a potential immigrant could bring to this country, rather than say a preference for, say, family reunification, which you have in the law now. So we could make that change and focus on people who could bring either commercial skills, business skills, cultural skills into the country. You want to do that. You want to encourage that.
But see, I don't understand why Congress doesn't do that. So if you look at the polling on immigration issues, refugees particularly, but also low-skilled immigration, which obviously depresses wages.
Right.
That's why employers of low-skilled employees are in favor of it. People are not for this. This summer there was a poll done in Chicago. 36% of Americans supported resettling Syrian refugees here. Why wouldn't the Congress take that up? They're supposed to be representing the people. Why wouldn't they say, no Syrian refugees? People aren't for it. Well,
I think what we should do vis-a-vis the humanitarian crisis in Syria, we should look at establishing safe zones in that region and help them, help Jordan, help other countries who would be willing to temporarily relocate people from Syria before so when the conflict ends, they are able to hopefully go back to their homeland. That's something that we should do. We always have had, though, an impulse in this country for humanitarian reasons, to bring in people who have been oppressed or victims of war or other things. But the overriding issue in terms of our benefit to the United States is, I think, an important one. And look at the district I represent in upstate New York. We need to bring in workers, migrant workers, in and out of the country. It's gotten increasingly difficult to bring in workers to harvest the crops, to pick the fruit, etc. So those people come in and they go out, and we need to have a good expeditious system whereby fruit growers and farmers can allow that to happen.
Do you think certain industries have a moral right to low-wage labor? Because, of course, without the flow of that labor across borders, they would have to pay market rate.
You know, Tucker, the apple growers in the Hudson Valley, you know what they've told me?
What?
They can't get Americans to pick the fruit.
At what price?
At virtually any price.
Any price,
yes.
Really?
Yeah, it's really amazing. And it's tough work. And they'd much rather have migrants coming in from the Caribbean who come in during the harvest season and then go home.
Are you worried that, broadly speaking, not just in the apple orchards of New York, but that the United States is creating a kind of serf class where low-wage immigrants come and do the unpleasant work that Americans don't want to do? And is that healthy for the democracy long-term?
Well, I'm not really worried about that. I'm more worried about getting more economic growth in our country so that we can lift the opportunity for everyone. And that's why we need to do the tax and regulatory changes that I ran on, and I think that President Trump ran on, and that the Republican Congress is hopefully going to be able to effectuate. I think that's the bigger problem for us right now. We have a slow growth economy, and that's really hurting our ability to increase family income.
But if you have a country where anybody who makes over 200 grand a year, which is everyone in the political establishment, everyone in the media, everyone in Hollywood, the people running the show have no contact with things like washing the car, changing your own kids' diapers, doing your own laundry, doesn't it create, and I'm not attacking this, I mean, I'm one of those people, but doesn't it create a pretty big disconnect between the ruling class and the rest of the country?
I think the vast majority of the country, when they have a kid, they know how to change diapers.
But you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, you've walked through neighborhoods here, there's not one person who would know how to wash his car, change his, right? I mean, does that have an effect on the culture that we should be worrying about?
Well, I think maybe it does. That's a profound question. I'm not so sure in this particular instance. I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on trying to make sure we get this immigration ruling right. And that we make sure that our friends and allies abroad understand that we're a welcoming country, but also making sure that we are, and the President is right in this regard, making sure we're protecting ourselves from migrants who are coming into the country or potential bad actors coming into the country who are coming from places where there's no security, where we're not vetting those people properly. I think that's the primary issue that I'm concerned about right now.
My last question, just to get a philosophical one. I often hear people say that, and I understand we want the rest of the world to know we're a welcoming country.
Right.
But why exactly? I mean, Japan is not a welcoming country. China's not a welcoming country. It's not that they're diminished in the eyes of the rest of the world, are they?
Our national motto, out of many one, e pluribus unum. I mean, we are a melting pot. We have always been that way, and I think we should maintain that. What we should do it smartly. And we've had periods in our history where we've restricted immigration and where we've enhanced it. And maybe we're in a period where we're looking at bringing in more people who have greater job skills, greater potential to contribute to our economy than in the past. And I think that would be advisable. But at the same time, let's not forget how this country was founded and what we stand on.
All right. Congressman, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. This new senior political analyst, Britt Hume. Britt, what do you think is likely to happen? What ought to happen? What do we make of this?
Well, being in the Ninth Circuit, you'd have to sort of guess that the judge's order will be upheld, and thus the pause on the immigration pause will remain in effect. I must say, having listened to the arguments, that those judges got pretty far afield from the question before them, which was simply this: did the president have the authority under his constitutional duties to impose this temporary ban, and did the judge who ordered it halted temporarily have the authority to do that? Those are the questions, it seems to me. And before you know it, judges were asking for evidence of danger from the countries involved. That's way beyond the purview, it seems to me, of this particular at this particular hearing, at this particular stage of this case.
So you heard part of this exchange. We just played it with Trace Gallagher, but the lawyer speaking to the judge and saying, look, as to the question of intent, we know this was an intentional Muslim ban based on statements that the now president made during the campaign. Is that germane to the constitutional questions at the heart of this, do you think?
I think it is utterly irrelevant to the constitutional question. I mean, I've never heard of such a thing being introduced into a case like this. But this is where those judges felt free to go, and this, of course, is very much in keeping with the reputation of the judges in that Circuit Court of Appeals. They are famous for getting outside the normal bounds of what judges should decide, and that's why they get slapped down so often by the Supreme Court. This is what they do.
Which is the next stop on this, and so that's the obvious follow-up. If the ban on the pause is upheld, does the
pause on the ban or the ban on the pause? Either way works, right?
if the travel ban is lifted in effect by the Ninth Circuit, does it move inexorably to the Supreme Court after today?
I think this whole matter will eventually get before the Supreme Court, because remember, Tucker, we're dealing with preliminary motions here in this case. I mean, the purpose of the temporary restraining order, which the judge in Seattle imposed, was simply to freeze the status quo until the case itself, the underlying case, could be adjudicated. So either way, that case, it seems to me, whether the president's policy restrictions go into effect or whether they are held in abeyance, that case and other cases around the country will go forward. And it seems to me, unless courts of appeals across the country completely slap down the plaintiffs in these cases, I think the matter is likely to end up before the Supreme Court, one way or the other.
So here's a political question for you, and a distressing observation for me anyway. Where's the debate about the underlying principles here? How many people we ought to be allowing from this part of the world, if people from this part of the world are uniquely threatening to us? What's our obligation to refugees and immigrants, et cetera? Is there going to be a public debate on those core questions at some point, do you think?
Well, perhaps not in the context of this lawsuit, but you would think going forward there would be, because this administration obviously plans to reform our immigration policies in such a way that they may more closely conform to their view of the issue you were talking about earlier, which is what's in the best interest of the United States, not necessarily what's in the best interest of the United States image in the world, but what's in the best interest of the United States in hard, practical terms. In other words, who can contribute what to our economy? Who is likely to come here and help build the country? Who is likely to be successful? And those are all the questions that would have to feed into a broader question of how you legislate now on immigration going forward.
Yes, those seem like fair questions. All right, if you just stay right there for a second, we're going to listen in to part of what each side argued today before the Ninth Circuit in court. First, this is the Trump administration side. Listen.
May it please the court. I'm August Flengy with the Justice Department here on behalf of the United States. I'd like to reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal. The executive order at issue puts a temporary pause on entry for individuals from 7 countries that Congress and the last president determined, in a similar context, pose special risks in terms of terrorist infiltration into our country. Those determinations were made in 2015 and 2016, based either on a congressional determination or statutory factors, including their foreign terrorist organizations had significant presence in the country, or the country served as a safe haven for terrorists. The order also temporarily halted refugee program. This judgment was well within the president's power as delegated to him by Congress, and it is constitutional, as the court in Boston in the Halal Kalam recently held. Under Section 212F, Congress has expressly authorized the President to suspend entry of classes of aliens when it is necessary or when otherwise it would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. That's what the President did here. And the President's determination that a 90-day pause was needed for the 7 countries at issue here in order to ensure adequate standards, and that's language from the order, for visa screening was plainly constitutional. The district's court's order, which contained no assessment of the legality of the order, was in error, and we encourage the court to stay. A key factor in the order and its temporary nature was the President's determination that there was a need to review existing practices for screening foreign nationals who apply for visas.
Okay, not a very dynamic picture, but an interesting argument. That was the administration side of things. Here's what the states had to say in response.
Absolutely, Your Honor. Absolutely. The parties have agreed to a briefing schedule. The preliminary injunction motion will be fully briefed by a week from Friday. I'm confident that Judge Robart will schedule a hearing and rule quickly after that. I'd also point out that the 14-day limit is for ex parte temporary restraining orders by its text. This one, part of the problem with treating this as a temporary restraining order, Your Honor, is that if the defendants are right that any time the court enters a temporary restraining order after a hearing and receiving briefing, it's treated as a preliminary injunction. That's a terrible rule to create for district courts, because it discourages them from hearing from the other side before entering a temporary restraining order. But Your Honors, I do certainly want to move on to the merits. I don't want to spend all your time on this. And of course, if this is treated as a motion for stay, we obviously still believe that the court should reject that motion. And the most simple basis for that, of course, would be the lack of irreparable harm. I heard Your Honors again pressing counsel for a statement of what the irreparable harm is, and still no clear factual claims or evidentiary claims of what that irreparable harm would be from a stay. And in fact, it was the executive order itself that caused irreparable harm to our states, to Washington and Minnesota and our residents, and to many other states and people, as described in the many amicus briefs that have been filed. So of course, we believe that the federal government has shown no irreparable harm from reinstating the status quo prior to the executive order.
All right, there's a lot going on there. Everyone in those tapes passed the bar exam, so it's hard to decipher exactly what they meant. So we're bringing in the great Britt Hume to translate for us. So you said at the outset something I think we should keep reminding ourselves of, which is the basic argument here is, does the President of the United States have a constitutional ability to do things like this, to control who comes in and out of the country? And does he, historically? Does precedent support that?
Well, it does, and not only that, there's legislation which you heard the government lawyer, the Justice Department lawyer referred to, which is a law that was passed in 1952, which has been repeatedly quoted by the government here, which gives the president the authority at any time to suspend immigration from any country or region or wherever he wishes if he believes it is in the national security of the United States for him to do so. That's not a quote, but that's the sense of it. Now, there was a subsequent law passed in 1965, which the plaintiffs in this case have tried to rely on, which said you can't discriminate based on race, color, religion, nationality in immigration policy. That seems to me to be not quite in play here, simply because this was a national security finding, and it is not the imposition of a policy. It is the imposition of a pause in current immigration practice pending review to determine what new screening procedures might be adopted. So I think that on legal terms, the government has the best of the argument. But having said that, I think that I'm not a lawyer, but I've covered a lot of legal cases, and I've been a defendant in a couple. And I think the government should win and will eventually prevail. The question is whether this should be allowed to go on this long with the president's national security order in abeyance.
Well, that is the question. Now, all of this is an outgrowth of what the president's opponents are calling a resistance to Donald Trump. Not opposition, resistance. It sounds like something that de Gaulle led against Vichy. I mean, they're kind of framing this in martial terms. What do you make of the resistance against Trump or to Trump?
Well, the resistance in the country, I think, is a function of the fact that he's viewed as like the Antichrist by the left and some who are not on the left, left. In Congress, I review this all-out resistance, as a function of the Democrats being in something like the same position that the Republicans were when President Obama was in office and the Republicans got control of first the House and later the Senate. Their constituents, those who put them in office, or who felt they did, and they certainly contributed to it, thought that they were going to do all sorts of things to reverse Obama policies, that they'd be able to repeal Obamacare, that they'd be able to defund the government if necessary to stop these policies from taking effect, and so on. As a political matter, it was much more difficult than they supposed, as we learned when the government got shut down in a fight over funding Obamacare, and the public turned, to an extent never before seen in the polling, against the Republicans. Now, later on, of course, they prevailed in the election, and everybody later said that it was that the shutdown didn't hurt. It did hurt. But the problem for the Democrats is that they're in an even weaker position than the Republicans were, because they control neither house of the Congress.
That's right.
And, of course, not the White House. So their ability to resist effectively is diminished, and we found the ultimate example of that today. They really they went all out to stop Betsy DeVos. They peeled off a couple of Republicans, and they ended up, in the end, Mike Pence cast the decisive vote, and Betsy DeVos tonight is the Secretary of Education.
Well, weakness is the key. I mean, extremism tends to grow from weakness rather than from strength. What I find so striking, though, is that even members of Democrats in the House, who we think of as kind of far out, avid lefties, I don't know, Barbara Lee, Maxine Waters, they seem moderate by comparison to a lot of Democratic voters right now. Do you get that impression?
Well, I'm not sure they're moderate, because, Maxine Waters is already, talking about when the time comes she's going to move to impeach the president.
Yes.
She said that, I think it's in a somewhat different news conference from the one where she said that Russia invaded Korea. I think she meant Crimea. But, with Maxine Waters, all sorts of things get said. But I think, those people are pretty far out there. But for the Democratic caucus as a whole to be as far out on these limbs of resistance to Trump is something new and something we haven't quite seen before. And the question, I think they feel they have to do it because they've got a constituency that's really up in arms and unable to adjust in any way to the fact that Trump is president, and they think they can strangle his presidency in its crib. And they're trying to do that. So far, not very effectively, but noisily. And then, as in the case of this lawsuit, I suppose you could argue that they've at least succeeded in stalling it to some extent.
So I would say at least Maxine Waters is suggesting peaceful means, which puts her in a different category from a lot of the people who are voting for her and writing on the internet.
Yeah.
So, but so they've got 2 years until there's any kind of election, until there's anything they can do electorally about the Republican lock on the federal government. So does this burn itself out, this rage, this intensity? Does it go away? Does it escalate? What happens between now and then?
I think that's a $64 question, Tucker, whether this, people simply get tired and after they've, broken their pick on issue after issue, after nominee after nominee, and perhaps policy after policy. But look, the left, remember, Tucker, is the branch of our polity that cares about government.
Right.
And they've lost control of government. And it means a lot more to them in a way than it ever did to the right. The right was mostly trying to get control of the government so they could slow it down. The left believes is the party of government. It's the Democrats are the party of government, and they're going to fight as hard as I think they have to fight in order to see if they can wrest control of it back. Because this is their lifeblood. This is what they believe in, and it means more to them than it does to anybody else. So I don't know that I can't see them giving up or giving in. They might wear out, but I don't see them giving up.
So, but what I sort of wonder with these confirmation hearings, and you're going to see one tomorrow where Democrats are going to stay up all night to delay again the vote on the prospective Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Do they get any victories in any of this? Any actual victories rather than just moral victories?
I think they don't get any actual victories, but I think to their base and to their most angry constituents, it may be satisfying somehow to see, a temporary frustration of Jefferson Sessions, becoming Attorney General and the president getting his way on that. So they will block, stall, delay, complain, criticize, attack, and of course their allies in the media, who are legion, are part of the whole picture here, and so they're going to get a lot of help from that. This is going to be a noisy and rancorous atmosphere, perhaps more than we've seen, and it's been pretty bad for some time, as you know, Tucker. But I think it's going to be bad and perhaps worse for as far as the eye can see.
So let me just ask you one last question. If you look at the groups arrayed against Trump, and by the way, I think there are things to criticize about the Trump administration. I'm not saying there aren't. But if you look at the professional agitators or opponents of the Trump administration, it really does look like the coalition of the privileged, actually. So it's Hollywood, it's the political class, it's the tech community. It's people in upper income brackets. Have you ever seen anything like that before? It's a revolution from above, it looks like to me.
Well, yeah, it's true. And the other thing is, Tucker, the Democratic Party for some time has been increasingly becoming the party of the very poor and the very rich. And what happened to them in this most recent election is that they lost that, working class element that had been so important to their hold on states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin, Minnesota, Wisconsin and the other states out in the Midwest that they lost this time, which is what cost the presidency. So this is a party of the sort of the two income extremes now. And, the Hollywood left, which has been getting more so all the time, is rabid on the subject of Trump, and I think that the African American community didn't support him, although they didn't turn out for Hillary in the way they did for Barack Obama, and that's part of the story of what happened here. But I think you're right about that. It's the top and the bottom.
Is there any effort? So after the election, I remember talking to you about this, and we saw the industrial Midwest go to Trump against most expectations, and the thought at that point was, well, holy smokes, they've got to figure out a way to run people like Senator Casey or, Democrats with a proven record of an appeal to the middle of the country, to the middle class. But you haven't seen, at least in public, efforts to figure out a program to appeal to those voters. Do you think they've given up on the middle class?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I do think, Tucker, that if you look at the race for the chairmanship of the Democratic Party, it does not look like anybody's looking for a centrist. I mean, what you have is left and lefter. Look, the Democratic Party is nowhere near dead. It will come back. Its moment will come again, maybe sooner than we think. But for the near term, I think they're stuck without power and an enraged constituency, which will encourage members of the party to carry out actions which I don't think will be successful, which I think will only lead in turn to more frustration. And even though Donald Trump, as we've seen, gives them ammunition to fight with all the time, they have not so far applied it very effectively.
Yeah, well, craziness abets craziness, and I hope it doesn't go to dark places. I really do. Britt, thanks a lot for joining us and for the wise summation.
You bet, Tucker.
We'll continue to follow this breaking news throughout the hour. The website BuzzFeed, meanwhile, defied conventional norms of ethical journalism and published an unverified dossier claiming, among many other salacious things, that Donald Trump had been co-opted by Russian intel. Just a month later, BuzzFeed is getting sued not by Trump, but by the IT company Webzilla. The dossier claimed that Webzilla, its parent holding company XBT Holdings, and its Russian owner, Alexei Gubarov, had all collaborated with the Russian government and the Trump campaign to hack the Democratic National Committee. Now, BuzzFeed has already apologized for not redacting Gubarov's name in the document, but that was not enough to spare them a lawsuit. Val Gerbitz is a founding partner at the Boston Law Group, and he is representing Webzilla and its owner in the suit, and he joins us now. Val, thanks for joining us. So,
thanks for having me, Tucker.
What is the core allegation in your suit?
Well, the core allegation is that my clients woke up one day after having built up an incredibly successful web hosting provider. Webzilla and XBT are approximately a $250 million company with almost 40,000 servers across the world, with offices in 9 different countries. And as you can imagine, their reputation and the reputation of their CEO and founder, Alex Gubarev, depend on their clients trusting the services that they provide. One day, they woke up to find that a report was published by BuzzFeed that essentially accuses them of committing crimes against the United States by using their companies to hack computers of the Democratic National Party, which is an absolute fabrication. And so because their reputation has been tarnished in this way, they really had no choice but to take legal action.
So I want to go right to the text here. This is from the now famous dossier published on BuzzFeed, and it begins redacted. We don't know the name. Reported that over the period of March-September 2016, a company called XBT Webzilla and its affiliates had been using botnets and porn traffic to transmit viruses, plant hugs, steal data, and conduct altering operations against the Democratic Party leadership. Now, you say that that's not true in its specifics. Is it possible that Webzilla or any of its ancillary companies was unwittingly used to do those things?
No, it is impossible. It is a complete fabrication.
Why do you think it was fabricated, and why do you think you were included in that fabrication, or your client?
Well, you know, we look forward to conducting discovery to find out the answer to that very question. Our only guess, and it's literally a guess, is that some competitor decided that there's no legitimate way to compete with Webzilla, which provides wonderful service and is very well known to be an honest, efficient supplier. And maybe this is one way that a competitor can compete because legitimate competition doesn't work. But we really don't have a clue.
Yeah. Well, a lot about this is confusing. What's not confusing is the fact that BuzzFeed, which is an enormous news organization, massive investment from NBC and other big players in our media landscape, published this knowing that it might not be true. So the obvious question is, did anyone from BuzzFeed call anyone at the company you represent to ask, hey, were you a witting tool of Russian intelligence? Did they check it at all with you guys?
They did not, and that is most disappointing. Alex Gubarev is extremely accessible. After this story hit, almost 30 different reporters contacted him immediately. He's very accessible. If BuzzFeed was interested, they could reach out to him, he'd speak to them, he would explain to them that this is an absolute fabrication, and then at least they would have additional information. Maybe they could then use 3 strokes of a pen to redact the name Gubarev as well as XBT and Webzilla. They obviously redacted some other names, but for some reason they decided not to spare my clients.
So I think their position is, and we've interviewed the editor of BuzzFeed, Ben Smith, on this show, I think their position is, we're not endorsing this, we're not ratifying the conclusions in this document, we're just sort of putting them out there for the public to decide. Does that indemnify them against suits like yours? Because it's not their story.
It does not. It does not. And in fact, the way defamation law works is that if you repeat something that's defamatory, you now own that statement. And so by publishing it, and I have to point out that They were the first ones to publish it. Clearly, this document was in the possession of various news organizations for weeks.
Right.
And yet, no one published it. This is one of those rare situations where MSNBC, CNN, and Fox all agree on something, and they agree that this document should not have been published, that it was irresponsible.
Yeah, the details of it. I think CNN went with an overview, but they didn't go with the details of it. What's interesting, and maybe this has come to your attention, is that BuzzFeed, as I said, published this with the idea that the public needed to know, but they've done no substantial follow-up pieces. There hasn't, apparently, that I've seen, been an effort to report this out. They haven't continued to dig up facts on this dossier. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't think that they did any research prior to releasing it, and then they, of course, just continued to do nothing after releasing it. Our opinion is that they simply saw an opportunity to create traffic to their website, and they threw out this document hoping that it was a business decision. It was a pure business decision. Our client's view is that there is a war between elephants here. There's some warring elephants, and they're the mouse that got trampled in the process. They're collateral damage.
Yeah, that may be right. So I should have asked you this at the outset. What are you suing them for? How much?
Well, the lawsuit does not claim specific damages, but I can tell you that our damages, as of now, are in the millions, if not tens of millions.
What do you mean, if not? Are they in the tens of millions or not?
It's a rippling effect. Once bad reputation starts, so a client, we have credit lines that banks refuse to give us in the millions of dollars. We have clients that have refused to do business with us. We have prospective employees that we wanted to hire that refused to be hired by us. How those negative acts end up translating into dollars is still unclear. But like a rippling effect, they keep growing exponentially.
Huh. Ouch. Val, thanks
so as an example, if we're going to sell our company sometime down the road,
right.
And last year the companies grew 27%, and this is a very aggressive growth. If because of this news they stop growing or they don't grow as fast, and then down the road we have an exit, and instead of selling the companies for $300 million, we can only sell them for $250. How do you quantify that?
That's right. Maybe they should have called you first.
It would have taken a simple phone call, and I have to tell you, they apologized, but only after we filed suit.
Yeah,
so it wasn't like I actually wrote them a letter and pointed out that they made an egregious mistake and caused significant damage to my clients. We demanded an apology in the letter. It took a lawsuit to get them to apologize. Thanks for explaining it. Appreciate it. Up next, the Trump presidency may have given Senator Rand Paul a once-in-a-lifetime chance to pass a bill to audit the Federal Reserve. He'll be on next to tell us why exactly he wants to. Well, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul has been trying to audit the Federal Reserve for years now. Under President Obama, that was impossible, of course. Under an ordinary Republican administration, it would be pretty unlikely. But perhaps he can pull it off under President Trump, who has endorsed the idea. Senator Paul has introduced an Audit the Fed bill into the Senate and is campaigning hard for the Republican majority to pass it while they can. Senator Paul joins us here in Washington. Senator, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely.
So why would we want to audit the Fed? Why is this of concern to the average person who's not a banker?
I think an easier question is, why wouldn't we want to audit the Fed?
Right.
I mean, it's about transparency. It's about knowing what your government does. The Constitution gives the power to Congress to mint and coin money. We sort of transferred that power to the Federal Reserve in 1913. But I think we ought to know what they're doing. The dollar's lost 96% of its purchasing power. What does that mean? Your prices have gone up every year. What was once worth $1, is now takes $24 to buy what was once worth $1.
And that's the result of policies made at the Federal Reserve.
Absolutely. They print up the money, but it's sort of a codependency. And this is a dirty little secret. You need to have a Federal Reserve if you're going to have a $20 trillion debt. Why? They buy your debt. But they buy your debt by printing up money. So you can't have an enormous debt if you don't have a Federal Reserve printing up the money. But there are ramifications, and the ramifications are higher prices. So a lot of senior citizens will say, well, gosh, they tell me there's no inflation and I don't get an increase in my Social Security check, but the prices really are going up for them at the grocery store. So it all depends on how you measure inflation.
So there's been a massive amount of wealth floating around over the past 10 years, but famously, most of it seems to have stuck to a relatively small number of people. It's one of the factors behind this election, I think. think most would agree. How much of that has to do with Fed policy?
Well, the interesting thing is, everybody, particularly Democrats, talk about income inequality. Yes. But I think the Federal Reserve has a lot to do with it because people get richer who already have money. So you and I might have to go out and earn it, or if you're a school teacher, you got to work to earn your money. But if you have a bunch of money and you park it at the Fed, they pay you to keep it there. So we actually use taxpayer money to pay people just to have it sitting at the Federal Reserve.
What does the average person get out of the Fed's policy?
Well, you could say they get to the government borrows an enormous amount of money, so we get stuff we don't pay for, but we also get something that we don't want, and that is the recessions and the depressions that come about. There have been more recessions and depressions, bad things, since we got the Fed than there were before the Fed. And they gave us the Fed. They said, oh, we're going to have less depression. Well, the Great Depression came right after the Fed, and all of the downturns we've had have been with the Fed in existence.
To be fair, it's been 100 years, though. I mean, it's a long time.
Well, yeah, but a lot of downturns have happened. If you want to look at the most recent one, the crisis where the banking system was teetering on the brink in 2008, that was caused because the Federal Reserve kept the interest rates low and people kept building houses. Instead, what should happen, if a bunch of people are building houses and you and I go out and we're all buying houses, the price of money, the interest rate should go up, and then the economy will slow down as the interest rates go. But what happens if the Federal Reserve keeps the interest rates low permanently? Then what happens is you get a boom, and people are building houses like crazy, but they build too many houses because no one told them to stop building. Why did the Federal Reserve keep the interest rates low? To pay for a $20 trillion debt. If interest rates were to go back where they were historically, 5% or even 7%, the government can't pay for their debt.
So Janet Yellen, who runs the Fed, is against this. She said auditing the Fed would politicize monetary policy. Leaving aside the question of why that's bad, I mean, shouldn't elected representatives have a role in our economy? It seems pretty political to me already. Do you think it is?
Well, it makes me so mad that I introduced further legislation to make it illegal for the Federal Reserve to lobby us. We pay them. We appointed them, and we're supposed to oversee them, and they're lobbying against transparency. They're lobbying against our oversight. It's insulting. The main lobby against auditing the Fed is the Fed.
And who else? I mean, you don't have majority support in the Senate for this.
Actually, no, that's not true. We had 53 votes for it. We had 51 Republicans and 2 Democrats voted for it. Bernie Sanders voted for it.
I know that.
Tammy Baldwin did, and 51 out of 53 Republicans.
What's the opposition to this rooted in? I just want to give a fair hearing to their side. What's their argument?
Some see that the Fed pays for this massive debt, and they love big government, and they know that we have to have a big debt to have big government, and they have to pay for it, so they don't want to mess with the Fed because right now it's able to accommodate this enormous debt. One of the reasons I want oversight, though, is that I think a lot of people get hurt in the downturn. So in 2008, when the housing market went bust, I blame that on the Federal Reserve. And we're right in the middle of another boom. Anybody seen the stock market lately? It is a boom, just like the real estate boom of 2008, and it will come to an end. I wish I knew exactly when, so I could give your viewers some investment advice, but it will come to an end. There will be a correction. We have a huge bubble in the stock market created by easy money, free money. Everybody's got money. Federal Reserve will hand you bouquets of money. But there will be repercussions, and that'll be the downturn. There will be a response or reaction to all of this extra money.
So really quick, we're almost out of time. Elliott Abrams, who served in the last Bush administration, is under consideration to become Deputy Secretary of State. You wrote this: crack the door to admit Elliott Abrams and the neocons will become scurrying in by the hundreds.
Yeah, I think someone who was a never-Trumper, Abrams was a never-Trumper. He was disparaging and said to the president things about the president that he would never vote for him. He said the chair that Washington and Lincoln sat in, that Trump wasn't fit to sit in it. Someone who was a never-Trumper should never be in a Trump State Department. I mean, for goodness sakes. But he also represents things that Donald Trump doesn't. President Trump has been different than many. He said that nation building hasn't worked. When he said that, Elliott Abrams came forward and said, he's absolutely wrong. Nation building is what we need to do. Regime change, Iraq War. Elliott Abrams was one of the key architects of the Iraq War.
Yes.
We don't need people with the failed policies back in. Donald Trump does represent something new and different in foreign policy, and I think a welcome relief from the neocons. So I hope he doesn't appoint somebody who doesn't really agree with him.
I'm baffled by it, I got to be honest. Senator Paul, thanks a lot for joining us. Appreciate it. President Trump is pushing to undo a lot of his predecessor's legacy, but one action of the Obama administration is completely intact. Last May, a decree from the Departments of Justice and Education ordered all public schools to let their transgender identifying students use whichever bathroom they wanted to use, even if it didn't match their physical sex. That order is still in force. And in an odd twist, conservative Christians, evangelicals, and radical feminists are teaming up to fight it. Kara Dansky is the board chair for Women's Liberation Front. It's a self-described radical feminist group that strongly opposes President Obama's order, and she joins us now. Kara, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Normally, you'll describe someone as a radical feminist, and they will take offense, but you describe yourself that way.
Well, you might describe someone, and they might take offense, but I'm proud to call myself a radical feminist.
Interesting. So I just want to establish that you are not on the right at all in any way, and yet you've made common cause with people who are.
Agreed.
The line that struck, I was reading your views on this, the line that struck me was, this is more than about bathrooms. What does that mean?
This goes far beyond bathrooms. And so when people talk about this as a bathroom bill or a bathroom controversy, it's really not about that for us. In part, it goes to within the realm of like bathrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, shower rooms, what the interpretation of sex to mean gender identity means is that potentially any male who self-identifies as female can access any women's bathroom, locker room, changing room, etc., dormitory, school. Yes. But it goes even far beyond that to redefine women and girls to mean essentially anyone who identifies as a woman or girl for purposes of Title IX, which matters to us because we think that women and girls are a meaningful category worthy of civil rights protection.
You go on to say, this is about the erasure of women and girls. What does that mean, the erasure?
Well, Title IX was enacted in 1972 specifically to remedy centuries of discrimination against women and girls because women and girls had been discriminated against in and excluded from the educational arena for thousands of years, at least hundreds of years. And Title IX was specifically enacted in order to remedy that. But now, if we define sex under Title IX to mean gender identity, what we're essentially saying is that women and girl can mean anyone who self-identifies as a woman and girl, which renders the category women and girls meaningless as a category. And it goes further than that. We see this in language all throughout society. We see, for example, women are no longer allowed to talk about body parts. We're not allowed to talk about pregnant women. We have to talk about pregnant people. We're not allowed to say that women have certain kinds of body parts. Language is degrading. We're seeing the erasure of women and girls as a meaningful
language
category.
And thought along with it. So acknowledging biological reality is now hate, in other words.
Yes.
So how, I mean, as someone on the left, I think it's fair to say, what has your life been like since you've said something like this publicly?
Well, what most of us who say things like this publicly receive is a lot of hate online, threats. We're called transphobic bigots because we ask questions about gender identity. And then it goes further. We are often threatened with rape and death. We're told that we need to shut up and go die in a fire because we're asking questions and we're standing up for women and girls. And that seems to be not permitted. And it's interesting to me that specifically the word bigot is used because the word bigot means someone who is intolerable toward another's views. Right. And I'm open to other, like I am open. If I'm wrong about this, I will own it. If someone can demonstrate to me that there's some legitimacy to gender identity ideology, then great. I'm
rooted in, for example, science.
Sure. I'm completely open to that. But instead what we see is when women and girls stand up and say, wait a second, what do you mean by gender identity? Like, I am a woman because I am an adult human female, which is the dictionary definition of woman. We are shut down immediately and told that we're transphobic bigots.
I've never thought I would say anything nice about a radical feminist group, but you said, we exist to protect all women and girls regardless of political affiliation, and I just want to say thank you for saying that. Because it's true. That's good for you. You're rare. Thanks a lot, Kara.
Thanks for having me.
We're still waiting an appeals court ruling on the Trump travel ban. We'll be right back with an update on that and more. Stay tuned. Ending as we began on a Fox News alert, President Trump's executive order on immigration is in the hands of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. A three-judge panel just heard arguments from both sides. The administration arguing its case against a challenge filed by Washington and Minnesota state governments ruling at any time. We'll keep you posted. Sean Hannity will have more right now. Have a great night.